In this episode, the featured film celebrates family, friends, and fairs, showcases an unparalleled talent in the history of show business, and proves that Hollywood can release the right film at the right time. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Meet Me in St. Louis was released in 1944. The story follows the Smith family of St. Louis. The year is 1903, so Meet Me in St. Louis is a period piece, although the film depicts events that happened just 40 years earlier. Meet Me in St. Louis is also a traditional Hollywood musical. And by traditional, we mean that at any given time, a character or characters may start singing to one another or sing to the camera. Now, even though it is a traditional Hollywood musical, it's not quite the same as other Hollywood musicals because there are only 4 featured songs. Take, for example, Singing in the Rain. That musical had 11 featured songs. So yes, Meet Me in St. Louis is a musical, but it is much more than that. It really is a year in the life of the Smith family and the things that happened to them during that year. The background is the World's Fair of 1904. So our film begins in the summer of 1903, which is just about a year before the fair. But that world of 1903 is as far removed from 1944 as it is today, because it was before 2 world wars. It was about 75 years after the last major war, so it was a relatively peaceful time. A time when Americans could look back and say, oh, wasn't that a wonderful time? Now, it wasn't necessarily all the more wonderful than other times, but it certainly was a peaceful time. And the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century, will always have an energy to it, especially at this time, because the late 19th century saw many inventions: the automobile, the telephone, the phonograph. But what it didn't have at this time was airplanes. It did not have television, of course. It did not have radio. It did not even have widespread electricity. So it was a very different time from 1944, and so therefore was a nice fable of life just 40 years before the release of the film. So this is a joyous film looking back on a very nice family in St. Louis at the turn of the century and just before the World's Fair. The timing of this release, 1944, is important because the world had been at war since 1939, and the U.S. had been involved in that war since December of 1941. Most of the world had suffered for at least 3 or 4 years. Suffered in the sense of either at the battlefield or in their own countries due to rationing. In other words, lots of things that might have been available before 1939 were no longer available. Very few cars were sold during this period. The factories of Detroit and other cities were making the weapons of war: tanks, artillery, etc. Perhaps washing machines weren't being sold, other appliances. And of course, food. Some food items were scarce. There was plenty of food in North America, but many items were scarce because anything that could be put towards the war effort was put towards the war effort. In these times, what was Hollywood to do? Hollywood was to make 2 kinds of films. They were to make propaganda films, which means bolstering our side against their side, against the bad guys. Often war films, sometimes not necessarily, but mostly war films. And these films would depict tremendous battles won by the Allies, the United States, the Empire of Great Britain, France, against the bad guys, which were Germany, Austria, Italy, and Japan. Because in December of 1941, the Japanese had attacked Hawaii. And so even though the U.S. was involved in helping Great Britain during the war, by 1941, they were completely involved in the World War. So propaganda films served their purpose. The good guys won. There were stars in these movies. They defeated the bad guys, and the bad guys were often depicted as horrible human beings, less than human, which would cause problems for Hollywood a little bit later when the government said tone it down, because sooner or later this war is going to be over and we have to rejoin the community of nations just like everybody else, and we don't want to leave this lasting impression that, for example, the Japanese were subhuman. But at the time, they did what they were supposed to do. Out of context, when we look at these war movies today, they're pretty hard to watch, and they certainly don't stand up too well, but they did what they had to do at the time. Movies that do stand up well were the other kind of movie to be shown during this war period, and that is uplifting, distracting, let's talk about something else kind of films. Let's do musicals, let's do romantic comedies, things that would allow the movie-going public to take their minds off a very difficult period and enjoy something else. And of course, by the early 1940s, Hollywood was awash in spectacular talent from all over the world, and after 10 years of making talking pictures, they really hit their stride. Such that by 1944, Meet Me in St. Louis was, in my opinion, a terrific film. Just a joyous ride, fun, terrific songs, and not surprisingly, it was the most successful film of the 1940s. Successful in terms of financial return, in terms of the number of people who saw it. I like the movie very much. In fact, there are many movies in the 40s, certainly during the war years, musicals that stand up very well today in various forms. So this was a pat on the back to Hollywood, because they did realize that if they presented these two kinds of films, the audiences would go and see them. And in fact, they did. We are going to make a movie about a family at the turn of the century. Very wholesome family, a big family. And we're going to tell about a year in their lives, a year leading up to a spectacular event, which was the World's Fair of 1904, which took place in St. Louis. But this is just the backdrop to the story, so we're going to focus on the family who just happened to be thinking about, as the whole city was and perhaps the whole world was, the next World's Fair. Now, the World's Fair of St. Louis wasn't the first World's Fair. The first one of its type would have been in 1851 in London, England, a very famous fair. There were a couple more after that, but none of the size and scope of the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. And it was going to be spectacular for a couple of reasons. The first one is that at the time, there was very little electricity in the world, even though it had been invented earlier. And the 1904 World's Fair would celebrate electricity in all its forms. The other element was inventions. We set our story at the turn of the century in Middle America, St. Louis, with a very wholesome family, big family, 4 sisters, 1 brother, a grandfather, and a housemaid, all living in the same big house, probably Hollywood big house. To structure this year, we're going to break it into 4 seasons. We begin with summer of 1903, and then follow along chronologically to the fall of 1903, the winter of 1903, and end with the spring of 1904. And in each of these periods, there are events that are showcased in the film. It isn't a 3 or 4 hour film, it's just under 2 hours. So we're going to pick out specific moments of each of these periods and show what happens to our family. Now, nothing serious happens to the family, nothing terrible. It is a comedy of sorts, but let's just say a lightweight musical, a thoroughly enjoyable musical with a family that is talented, needless to say, and prosperous. There could be many different families that would be chosen at the turn of the century, but in this case, we're going to choose an upscale family from a very nice neighborhood of St. Louis with a father who's a lawyer and a big house, and everybody is either good looking, pretty, but certainly healthy. Everybody looks so healthy. We also have a very nice cameo from a large tabby cat, which rounds out the household. So that's our structure. 4 seasons, an event in each season, leading up to the big event at the end of this period, spring of 1904 with the World's Fair. We're going to talk about the world of 1903, let's say 1900, and what it was like to live in that world, at least this particular family in this particular world. So 1900 was an incredible period. The turn of the century always brings energy to it, and I think this period more so than, say, 1799 to 1800, when America was still very young, and so there might not have been the groundswell of middle class and prosperity that there was 100 years later, and certainly not the same energy as the year 2000, 1999 to 2000, when there was the Y2K scare, and everybody was wondering if the world was going to go into chaos when the clock struck 12:01 in the year 2000. That's another story. If you're too young to know that, it's easy to find out. But in 1900, there weren't those fears. There hadn't been a war of any size for at least 35 years, and there was not to be another war for for at least the United States, for another 15 years. So it was a time of peace, a time of relative prosperity. Certainly for our family in St. Louis, it was a time of prosperity. And it's important to know that there was a lot of things that didn't exist at that time that might have existed 25 years later or less. There were no cars, or virtually no cars. There, of course, was no television. There was no radio. There were telephones, but no movies. So people at this time had to be entertained. Everybody in the modern era wants to be entertained at some point, whether it's a Friday night or a Saturday night. People look for entertainment. And so with the absence of these things that would not happen for 15 or 20 years, movies somewhat earlier, what do? Well, what you do is you hold parties, or you get together in your house, invite over the neighbors, and have not so much a party, but perhaps a nice French word called a soiree, where people would get together and they would, get ready for it, converse. They would talk to each other. They would talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. There might be some music in the background played by the guests, whether it's a piano, a violin, or whatever musical instrument someone was good at. And so that's how they would spend an evening. And I think that the key element in these soirees was the piano. Not every household had a piano, but many did. In fact, when I grew up, there was a piano in our house, a very old one, which means it might have been much more common and more used 50, 60 years earlier, because this piano was very, very old, but it had since been relegated to our basement. So people would entertain themselves with conversation, with food, and with entertainment like singing, playing musical instruments, and in our movie, all of those elements are there. Perhaps somewhat more accomplished singing and playing than the typical household of the time, but certainly, I think, reflected what it was like to entertain yourselves. The other element would have been a more formal gathering, which would have been called a ball or even a soiree that would take place in a public place, either outdoors in a pavilion if it was summertime, or indoors in some suitable place where there might be musicians, maybe less than 10. It wouldn't be a big orchestra, but musicians who would play, and there would be dancing. Probably everyone, as a social requirement, knew how to dance. That doesn't mean they were all Hollywood caliber dancers, but everybody knew how to dance. Not everybody knew how to sing, but that element was critical to the social world in which they lived in, and Meet Me in St. Louis showcases this. So if you have some money, if you are relatively prosperous, as this neighborhood appears that most of the people were prosperous, then this would be a rather agreeable lifestyle. Now, we can't turn the clock back. We can't say, oh, I wish we would all go out and just sit around and chat and maybe dance and have some music played. Our world is very, very different. It was only about 15 years later when movies became so popular that everybody went to the films. And it's certainly 20 years later, in the millions. Radio was to come on the scene, and people would sit around in their living room and listen to the radio. There would be amusements like singers and plays and just people talking, comedians, and that would be a focal point. And then, of course, about 50 years later, there would be television, and that would become probably the #1 source of entertainment in the household. So this world of socializing, of getting out, of going from someone's house to another one's house, going from this soiree to that soiree, not expensive, not a lot of money being spent. The food wasn't lavish, but there was just food and drink. Seems like a very agreeable lifestyle. And I think the appeal in 1944 to show Meet Me in St. Louis was that this lifestyle was gone. And certainly after 2 world wars, the world was very, very different, perhaps more cynical, perhaps less carefree, if that's possibly less carefree than it had been in 1900. The other element of our world in 1903, again, this particular neighborhood and this particular family, was that the men are all healthy and handsome, and all of them are either in an Ivy League school or about to go to an Ivy League school. And the women had big dresses and even bigger hair, and their job for the times was to latch on to one of these men and get married. Of course, that again showing that that world is gone. And of course, the role of women in the household and in society changed in the 20th century exponentially. But in 1900, if you came from a good family, you were trying to get married when you became of age. So that's the other element of this period of history. In a relatively prosperous, calm, and flourishing community like St. Louis, at least the neighborhood of St. Louis that is shown in the movie. The source material for Meet Me in St. Louis was a semi-autobiographical novel by Sally Benson, who lived in St. Louis with a large family at the turn of the century. I think she had been serializing a selection of stories in magazines and eventually led to a novel. And Hollywood was aware of this book and used the stories to make Meet Me in St. Louis. That's a very brief overview of Sally Benson's contribution to Meet Me in St. Louis. There's an oddity that 20 years later, Sally Benson would be a screenwriter for a movie called Viva Las Vegas, an Elvis Presley vehicle that is about as far removed from 1900 St. Louis as is imaginable. But that's Hollywood for you. Now that we have our story, we have excellent source material, we have a structure that works, 4 seasons, an event in every season. Let's look at the casting again, as I say, which is critical. This one was a no-brainer because, again, of the time of the release. The star, the center, the entire focus, for the most part, of Meet Me in St. Louis is a lady known as Judy Garland. She was the biggest star in Hollywood in the 40s, but she began in the mid-30s as a singer and dancer, but her career was catapulted to superstardom with the release in 1939 of a movie called The Wizard of Oz. Now that's a movie I don't care for because I saw it as a kid and I've been psychologically scarred ever since. I just didn't like those monkeys. However, when you see The Wizard of Oz, there is a song that is the center to that movie. It's a wonderful movie. There's so much going on in it. It has survived the test of time like almost no other movie has. But the song is Judy Garland singing Over the Rainbow. And no one sings Over the Rainbow like Judy Garland. It didn't really hit me when I was a young kid watching it, the movie The Wizard of Oz, but when I have seen those clips of her singing it, there's a voice there that generational, that is beyond anything you can imagine. In this young girl, a very pleasant face, and it's very understandable that she became a superstar. And of course, Hollywood knows how to market superstars, because between 1939 and 1944, beginning with The Wizard of Oz and ending with Meet Me in St. Louis, Judy Garland made 14 movies. She probably sang and danced in almost all of them. Now that's a lot of movies. And she would have made records for sale, her voice, so she would make records, and she also would do radio programs. So at a very tender age, she was an extremely busy superstar. And in fact, it is well documented that she might have been used until there was nothing left of her. Documentaries, books, everything about the tragic life of Judy Garland really began in this period, because she was just squeezed out of every bit of talent that they could squeeze out of her, and there was a lot of talent to squeeze. However, in 1944, she was at the height of her game, and her role in this film is nothing short of critical, and her performance is, I think, spectacular. So Judy Garland is the center of this film. She looks wonderful, big head of red hair, very healthy. That might not have been the case a few years down the road, but in 1944, she looked terrific. She felt terrific. She has stated, if you ever look it up, that she felt beautiful in this film. The director, a fellow by the name of Vincent Minnelli, would actually marry her before the film was released. So it was a joyous experience for her, and it was a joyous experience for us. There's one other character in this film that's worth mentioning, and she is mentioned a tremendous amount because moviegoers generally like kids, very young kids, with one proviso. They have to be precocious. They have to talk like adults even though they're 4 or 5 years old. And this movie has a character named Tootie, who is based upon one of the characters from Sally Benson's autobiographical stories. And she gets into all kinds of trouble and provides a lot of comic relief in the film, and also some really touching scenes near the end. And this actress, Margaret O'Brien, was very young at the time, very precocious, and it just really works nicely in the film. She is memorable, but she does not steal any scenes, I think, from Judy Garland, because Judy Garland just explodes on the screen in this film. But Tootie is a fun character to watch. And now this is an ensemble cast. There are the sisters. There is the boy next door. Well, there sounds like a song there. And the grandpa and the mother and father. So there's plenty of excellent actors in this film, adding some depth to it, contributing to the charm of the film. But this movie is a Judy Garland movie, first, last, and always. Meet Me in St. Louis does follow the Smith family over the course of approximately 12 months, or certainly 4 seasons. But Meet Me in St. Louis is a traditional musical. And even though there are only 4 songs in this movie, 2 of these songs I want to focus on very closely because I find one of the songs spectacular and the other one is generational. The first song is called the Trolley Song. And if you go on to streaming media, it is really easy to find this clip of the beginning of the song to the end. And it's wonderful in a number of ways. First of all, it's a traditional Hollywood piece. There's lots of people singing, lots of colorful dresses. It's a nice scene. They all bundle up into the trolley car. So it's the summer. And what do you do in the summer when 6 or 7 months away is the World's Fair? Well, you take the trolley out to the fairgrounds and see how it's going. I guess that's something you do on a Friday night in the summer in St. Louis. So everybody piles onto this trolley car. Now, the one other interesting thing about this is that the trolley is electrified. There's a lot of horses and buggies on the streets of St. Louis, at least the neighborhood that the movie depicts. But the trolley is electrified, and that would have been somewhat, not necessarily unique, but there wasn't a lot of electricity in many American towns at this time, except for perhaps trolley cars, certainly not streetlights. So everybody is dressed not elegantly, but just colorfully, and they get on the streetcar, and of course, this is a time for a song. But there's one element to this scene that I like a lot, and that is I used to drink my share of smoothies when I was younger and very, very busy athletically. And when I started doing that, I had never heard of a certain vegetable, leafy vegetable. And when I started drinking vegetable smoothies, I came across this vegetable. And I've seen Meet Me in St. Louis many times, but it was only after I started drinking smoothies and I saw the film again that I noticed something just at the beginning of this scene. Two of the fellows are talking about how they're going to the fairgrounds. They're going to see how the construction is progressing. And one of them says this World's Fair is going to cost up to $50 million. And the other fellow says, man, that's a lot of kale. And for the life of me, I had never heard the word kale before or knew of the vegetable before I started drinking vegetable smoothies. And there it was, right in 1944, someone referencing kale as a slang for money. Go figure. So everybody gets on the streetcar, lots of singers, nice chorus, and it is an occasion to sing a song. And that song is called the Trolley Song. And for me, it just is wonderful. It's tough to appreciate music for modern viewers when they are used to the music of the times. And everybody grows up with their music when they're younger, when they're teenagers, and what they like and what they don't like. But as you watch more and more movies from different eras, and as you listen to music from different eras, you can appreciate the songwriting, the voices, the style of songs that were very popular in their day and are still popular to this day. And so I love this song. And if you can appreciate a song from the 40s, such as the Trolley Song, it's the same kind of experience to be introduced to classical music, which is not a function of our current times. It is not a function of the rock and roll era. In fact, much of rock and roll now is not current today. So I think one of the charms of being a movie fan and watching movies from every period is you get introduced to things like songs of the era. What did people listen to? What did young people enjoy, or people of any age enjoy, and why? And when you see the talent involved, and Judy Garland singing this song, and that voice which is generational as some of the songs she sings, it's magical and it's wonderful, and it's such a feel-good moment in the film. And this ends the period of the summertime in our chronology of the year of the Smith family. That's the Trolley Song. The other song I want to focus on for me was, I won't say life-changing, but it stopped me dead in my tracks when I saw this film for the first time. Now, I think I'd heard this song before, like I had other songs of the 40s and 50s, and never knew where they came from. So when I saw these movies for the first time, it said, hey, I know that song. I've heard that song other places. An example would be a movie in the 50s called The Music Man. And there's a charming, charming song in that movie called Till There Was You. And I thought, wait a minute, I was a Beatles fan when I was a kid. I'm a Beatles fan to this day. And Paul McCartney sings a magnificent version of that song. Okay, great. I know Till There Was You. I've heard it a million times. Love the song. And then I saw The Music Man for the first time. And at a certain point in that film, Robert Preston, who is the Music Man, sings to Shirley Jones, who joins him eventually in this song, Till There Was You. And it just floored me. Wow, this is where that song came from. Now, I've mentioned many times, and I've focused on a Christmas episode of this series, to say how much I like the Christmas season. I like it for all the things I mentioned before. Snow, the lights, the Christmas tree. It's in my DNA. But I also love the catchy tunes of the Christmas season. Anything that was catchy. And so I had heard many, many times, in many, many versions, a song called Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. It is, without competition, my favorite Christmas song. Because when I first saw Meet Me in St. Louis, there's a scene in the third chapter of this 4-season cycle, the Christmas season, where Tootie, our young girl, is sad, and she needs to be cheered up by older sister Judy. The story parameter is such that the father of the family has decided to move to New York City. I guess better opportunities as a lawyer, maybe more money to be made. And the family doesn't like that. They are born and bred in St. Louis, and they want to stay in St. Louis. And so there's a bit of conflict there. Very mild, not serious, of course, because this is a very uplifting film. But Tootie, as a very, very young girl, doesn't want to leave her snowman and her dolls, some of whom she has buried. That's a storyline that you have to see. And so she's crying at one point. And the scene is set up beautifully because it's Christmas. There's snow in St. Louis for, I guess there is snow in St. Louis at times, maybe not so much these days. And her older sister, Esther, who is Judy Garland, she takes Tootie upstairs out of the cold, and they're sitting at the windowsill looking at the snowmen that they've made down below. And she sings, "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." And for me, of all the songs Judy Garland sang, Over the Rainbow, and there's many more that she is famous for, none of them for me approach my pleasure at hearing her sing Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. The scene is beautifully photographed. She's got this, she was just at the ball, so she has this lovely red dress on. She's got a scarf wrapped around her head for her hair. She looks like $1,000,000. It's softly lit, beautifully photographed, and it's Judy singing. That voice of Judy Garland's, which, as I say, is generational, and it just makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. How beautiful it is, how beautiful the scene is. And I can not go through a Christmas without hearing that song a dozen times. And in fact, it's one of the few Christmas songs I can listen to at any time over the course of a year, because I think it's just perfect. The song is somewhat particular to the elements of the film. At one point there's a lyric that says, one day soon we all will be together if the fates allow. Until then we'll have to muddle through somehow. Well, that lyric has been changed because some people don't think it's apropos if you don't know the movie. And I don't particularly care for the changes that were made. So I'll just leave it at that, because Judy's version is as perfect a version as you can get in a song. Her voice is as perfect as you can get in a voice that sings the perfect song. It's just a wonderful experience. And if moviegoers are blasé about the film, yes, we know it's a period piece. Yes, we know they're sort of making fun of a simple world that no longer exists. This scene will take them to another level in this film. Yes, I like Meet Me in St. Louis, but I really love that scene where Judy sings Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. And for me, that was certainly my starting point. The film was fine the first time I saw it, but that scene just floored me. And since I've seen the movie many, many times, and some people consider it a Christmas picture, I don't really. It's a holiday picture to be sure, but that moment is unprecedented, I think, for holiday films, for Hollywood, the best of Hollywood, the best at what they could offer. Terrific song, and sung by probably the only person who could really give it justice. And if there's any takeaway from me watching Meet Me in St. Louis, it's Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. Meet Me in St. Louis finishes up in the spring of 1904 as the fair opens up. The family is dressed, I guess, the way people dress when they went to an auspicious occasion like the World's Fair. Everybody, the girls are all in white dresses, very, very gaudy white dresses. They go on a horse-drawn wagon or buggy, and they all head out to the World's Fair. And one of the elements that they showcase in just a few minutes left in the film is the turning on of the lights of the pavilions, which would have been unheard of at the time. This is electricity being showcased on a broad scale for the first time. Now, it might have been different in New York City, of course, the most progressive city in the US, but in St. Louis, it would come later. So it's a nice end to the film. The whole film gives you a warm feeling about what it might have been like. What was it like to live in 1900? Again, relatively prosperously, not filthy rich, but comfortable, in a world without all of the technology that we have today. There weren't even airplanes. There wasn't even radio. There were very few cars on the road at this time. Within 5 years, there would be many more. There were no movies, which in about 10 to 15 years, the movies would be flourishing. What a time it must have been to grow up and to, as a source of entertainment, to go from one house to another house. We're having a little soiree, a little party this Friday. Next Friday, it's a different family. Another Saturday, there's a summer ball or an autumn ball. It has a charm to it that is fun. And given that it was released in 1944, when most of the world had been enduring the hardships of what a world war brings, what a nice relief it must have been to go back to 1903 and watch this film. Watch a star that the whole audience would know, Judy Garland, singing unforgettable songs, a charming kid who gets into all kinds of trouble and gets out of trouble again, small T trouble, not big T trouble. The men acting very aw-shucksy types. Again, even though it was released in 1944, the filmmakers were making fun of that carefree, naive period of American history, at least at that time, for this story, where the men were all going to Ivy League schools and the women were getting dressed up with huge amounts of hair, hoping to get married to these men. I think it was a very agreeable life, even if it never really existed, but agreeable nonetheless. So we're not in 1944 anymore. The world is always a difficult place, and it's nice to step back and put yourself into a world that maybe never really existed, but almost did, and enjoy the carefree life, the music, the songs, and the romances that we see in Meet Me in St. Louis from the 22nd row.